My name is Margaret Ellison, but everyone in Savannah has called me Maggie for the past 84 years. Yesterday was my birthday, and I spent it alone in the kitchen of my antebellum home on East Jones Street, mixing cake batter with hands that still remember every recipe my grandmother taught me back in 1955. The yellow cake, David's favorite since he was 7 years old, sat cooling on the wire rack while I waited. I'd set the dining table with my wedding china, the spode pattern Harold surprised me with on our first anniversary. 3 place settings, just like I did every year, hoping this time would be different. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 o'clock, then 4, then 5. Nobody came. I remember when this house on Jones Street buzzed with life. 3 children running up and down these heart pine floors, their daddy Harold chasing behind them before the cancer took him in '78. Back then, my kitchen table couldn't hold all the birthday guests. Mrs. Henderson from next door would bring her famous chess pie. Pastor Williams would say grace. The children would fight over who got the first slice, and I'd laugh until my sides hurt. Now the only sound was the old Frigidaire humming, and my heart beating too fast for a woman my age. I pulled out the photo albums from the sideboard drawer, the same mahogany sideboard Harold's mother gave us as a wedding gift. Page after page of birthdays, Christmases, graduations, David in his cap and gown from Georgia Southern, the tuition I paid by working double shifts at Savannah Elementary for 3 years, Cheryl's wedding at Christ Episcopal, where I walked her down the aisle because Harold was already gone, and I'd paid for every white rose in that sanctuary. Luke's discharge papers from the army, framed and proud, after I helped him through that rough patch with the DUI lawyer fees. 46 years I taught 3rd grade at Savannah Elementary. 46 years of parent conferences, school plays, and staying late to help struggling readers. The children I taught are grown now, running businesses on Bull Street and River Street, sending me Christmas cards with pictures of their grandchildren. But my own 3 children, I haven't seen hide nor hair of them in 6 months. The doorbell rang at 6:30, and my heart jumped like a schoolgirl's. But it wasn't David or Cheryl or Luke standing on my front porch. It was Lena Washington, a sweet girl of 28, who helps me with the heavy cleaning twice a week. She works at Memorial Health during the day and goes to night classes at Armstrong State, studying to be a nurse practitioner. Her Aunt Rosalie lives 3 doors down and raised her right after her mama passed when Lena was just 15. Lena stood there holding a pot of her aunt's famous shrimp and grits and a mason jar full of gardenias from their yard. "Miss Maggie," she said in that soft voice, "that reminds me of my grandmother's. Aunt Rosalie told me it was your special day. Thought you might like some company." We sat at my kitchen table, just the 2 of us and that yellow cake, and talked about her nursing classes and my garden. She listened when I told her about teaching the Kessler boy to read back in '82, how he just sent me a photo of his own son graduating from high school. Lena has a way of listening that makes you feel heard, really heard, not like you're bothering someone with your old stories. After she left, I went back to the kitchen to clean up. That's when I saw the red light blinking on the answering machine Harold installed in 1995, right before he passed. One message, my heart lifted. Maybe one of them remembered after all. But when I pressed play, it wasn't for me. David's voice filled my kitchen, talking to someone else. "Listen, Mum's getting worse. Forgot to pay the electric bill again. Left the stove on twice last week. Cheryl and I think it's time we looked at Magnolia Manor or one of those places on Waters Avenue. She's becoming a real burden. And honestly, Luke and I can't keep running over there every time something happens. Maybe we should talk to someone about getting power of attorney before she does something dangerous." I sat down hard in Harold's old chair at the kitchen table. David had misdialed, meant to call his brother, got my number instead. A burden. After everything I'd sacrificed, every dollar I'd spent on their education, their weddings, their emergencies. After working until I was 70 to help Luke with his mortgage when the construction business went under. After taking in Cheryl and her 2 babies when her husband left her for that secretary at his law firm. I looked around my kitchen, at the cast-iron skillet I'd used to cook their breakfast every morning before school, at the kitchen table where I'd helped with homework and wiped away tears over broken hearts and failed tests, at the yellow cake nobody came to eat. That's when I remembered something David didn't know, something none of them knew, Harold had been smarter with money than anyone realized, and what he'd left me was considerably more than the modest teacher's pension they thought I lived on. Tomorrow, I decided, staring at that yellow cake, I was going to make some phone calls, starting with Mr. Harrow at Savannah Trust, whom I hadn't spoken to in 12 years. Sunday morning arrived grey and humid, the way October mornings do in Savannah when the Spanish moss hangs heavy and still. I'd barely slept after hearing David's message, but I put on my navy dress, the one with the small flowers that Harold always said brought out my eyes, and waited. At 11:30, right after services at Christ Episcopal, I knew they'd come. They always did on the first Sunday of the month. Out of duty more than love, I was beginning to understand. Sure enough, David's silver Lexus pulled into my driveway at 11:45. He climbed out wearing that same impatient expression he'd worn since childhood when asked to do chores. Behind him came Cheryl in her BMW, the one I'd helped her buy after the divorce settlement wasn't as generous as she'd expected. Luke arrived last in his pickup truck, looking uncomfortable in his church clothes. I'd prepared lunch the way I had for 40 years. Fried chicken, green beans cooked with fatback, cornbread from my grandmother's cast-iron skillet, and sweet tea in the crystal pitcher Harold's mother had left me. The dining room table was set with my good china, the silver I'd inherited from my own mother, polished to a mirror shine. They sat in their usual spots, David at the head where Harold used to sit, Cheryl to my right, Luke across from her. But something was different this time. They kept exchanging glances, the kind of looks that exclude the person sitting right there with them. Finally, David cleared his throat the way he does before delivering bad news to his insurance clients. "Mum," he began, cutting his chicken with more precision than necessary, "we've been talking, and we're worried about you." "Worried?" I set down my fork and studied my eldest son's face. At 56, David had Harold's jaw, but none of his warmth. Success in the insurance business had made him comfortable, but not happy. "What exactly are you worried about, sweetheart?" Cheryl leaned forward, her blonde hair styled in the same expensive cut she'd worn since her divorce 5 years ago. "Mama, you forgot to pay the electric bill last month, and Mrs. Henderson called David about you leaving the stove on." I almost laughed. I paid Georgia Power 3 days early, like I have for the past 30 years, and I left a pot of butter beans simmering on low heat while I watered my garden. That's not forgetting. That's cooking. Luke, my baby boy who'd barely spoken since he arrived, finally looked up from his plate. At 51, he still had the gentle eyes that had gotten him out of trouble as a child, but there was something calculating in them now. "Mum, you're 84. This house is too big, the stairs are dangerous, and you're all alone out here." "I've lived in this house for 52 years, I said quietly. "I raised 3 children in it, buried a husband from it, and taught half of Savannah to read from the kitchen table you're sitting at. I'm not leaving." That's when Cheryl pulled out a folder from her purse. A manila folder thick with papers and brochures. My heart started beating faster as she spread them across my dining table, right over my grandmother's lace tablecloth. "We've already toured Magnolia Manor," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It's lovely, really. They have activities, medical staff on site, and you'd have your own apartment. Dr. Keene thinks it would be perfect for someone in your situation." "My situation?" I asked. "What situation is that, exactly?" David took over then, using his insurance salesman voice. "Mum, you're getting older. These things happen gradually, and sometimes the person experiencing them doesn't realize. We've already spoken to Jim Morrison at Century 21 about a realistic price range for the house." The words hit me like a physical blow. They'd toured facilities, they'd spoken to realtors, they'd discussed my situation with doctors and real estate agents, and Lord knows who else, but they hadn't spoken to me. "I see," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Cheryl reached across the table and patted my hand the way you'd pat a confused child. "Mama, we know change is hard, but we love you too much to let you stay here where something could happen, and no one would know for hours." Luke nodded earnestly. "We found a nice 1-bedroom at Magnolia Manor. It has a little kitchenette and a view of their garden. The deposit is only $10,000, and the monthly fee is $3,800. Very reasonable. Very reasonable." I looked at my 3 children, really looked at them, and saw strangers, When had they started seeing me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved? When had my life become something for them to manage like a business transaction? After they left, taking their empty promises to think about what would make me happiest, I sat in Harold's old chair and called information. I needed the number for Harrow Financial Services on Bull Street. Mr. James Harrow had been Harold's friend since college, the one who'd helped us plan for retirement, who'd handled the investments Harold had been so secretive about. I hadn't called him in 12 years, not since Harold passed, and I'd been too grief-stricken to think about finances. I'd lived modestly on my teacher's pension and social security, never touching what Harold had called his rainy day fund, but my children's betrayal felt like a hurricane, and I needed to know exactly what resources I had. Mrs. Ellison, Mr. Harrow's voice was warm with genuine surprise when his secretary put me through. I was wondering when you'd call. Your Harold left some very specific instructions about his investments, and frankly, you've been sitting on a gold mine longer than most people would. My hand tightened on the phone. Mr. Harrow, I think it's time I understood exactly what Harold left behind, and I think it's time I made some changes. Tuesday morning found me dressed in my best suit, the charcoal grey wool I'd worn to Harold's funeral, walking into the Griffin Tea Room on Bull Street at exactly 10 o'clock. James Harrow was already waiting at a corner table, looking distinguished at 72 with his silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when I approached, pulled out my chair, and ordered us both the house special, Earl Grey and cucumber sandwiches. Margaret, he said, using my formal name the way Harold always had in public, you look exactly the same as you did at Harold's service. He always said you aged like fine wine. I smiled, but my hands were shaking slightly as I opened the leather portfolio he'd placed between us. James, I need to understand what Harold left me. I've been living on my pension and social security, never touching his investments because frankly I didn't understand them and didn't need to. But circumstances have changed. He opened his own folder, pulling out documents with Harold's careful handwriting in the margins. Your husband was brilliant with money, Margaret. Absolutely brilliant. He started investing in real estate in the late 60s, bought stocks when everyone else was panicking, and he had an eye for companies before they became household names. The numbers he showed me made my breath catch. Harold had started with the insurance business, but he'd used every spare dollar to build something bigger, rental properties in Savannah's Victorian district that had tripled in value, stocks in companies I'd never heard of that had split multiple times, municipal bonds that had been paying steady interest for 20 years. The total liquid assets, James said quietly, including the sale of the rental properties if you chose to liquidate, comes to approximately $3.5 million. I set down my teacup with a clink that seemed too loud in the quiet tea room. Plus your house, which is worth another $400,000 in today's market. Harold was very specific about his wishes. He wanted you to have security, but hoped you'd never need to touch the principal. The interest alone has been accumulating for 12 years, Margaret. My mind reeled. My children thought I was a burden, scraping by on a teacher's pension, too old and poor to maintain my independence. They had no idea their mother was wealthier than any of them. James leaned forward, his expression serious. Harold made me promise something before he died. He said if anyone ever tried to pressure you into decisions you didn't want to make, I was to help you protect what was yours. He specifically mentioned your children, though he loved them dearly. He said they thought too much about money and not enough about people. I pulled out the will I'd brought with me, the one Harold and I had signed in 1995, splitting everything equally among David, Cheryl, and Luke. I want to change this, I said. Today? James nodded. I thought you might. I've already prepared new documents, pending your approval. What did you have in mind? We spent 2 hours at that table, redesigning my legacy. I removed my children as beneficiaries temporarily, putting everything into a revocable trust that I could change at any time. I named James as the executor and gave myself complete control over all decisions. If my children wanted to treat me like an incompetent old woman, they could discover exactly how competent I was. But the most important thing I did was add a new beneficiary, Lena Washington, the girl who brought me gardenias on my birthday, who listened to my stories, who saw me as a person worth knowing rather than a burden to be managed. When I got home, I found Lena on my front porch, holding a casserole dish and looking worried. "Miss Maggie, I knocked earlier, but you weren't home. I brought you some of Aunt Rosalie's mac and cheese. Thought you might be feeling poorly after Sunday's family dinner. You looked a little peaked when I saw you getting your mail yesterday." I invited her in for coffee, and we sat in my kitchen while she told me about her classes and her dreams of opening a clinic in an underserved part of Savannah. She talked about helping people who couldn't afford proper medical care, about making a difference in her community. "Lena," I said carefully, "what would you think about helping me with some paperwork? I need someone I can trust, someone who sees me clearly." Her dark eyes met mine. "Miss Maggie, you've been nothing but kind to me. Whatever you need, I'm here." That evening, I called attorney Michael Chen, whom Harold had recommended years ago for estate planning. Harold had always said Michael was sharp as a tack and honest as Sunday morning. I made an appointment for Thursday, telling him I needed to discuss some family matters that required discretion. As I hung up the phone, I looked around my kitchen in my house, bought with my husband's careful investments and maintained with my own steady work. My children wanted to put me in a facility, sell my home, and manage my affairs because they thought I was helpless. Tomorrow, I would start showing them exactly how wrong they were. But first I had some documents to gather and some phone calls to make. $3.5 million, James had said. Harold, bless his heart, had given me the power to fight back. Now I just had to decide how to use it. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of autumn chill that cuts right through you, and I should have taken it as an omen. I was in my kitchen, making biscuits for breakfast and planning my afternoon appointment with attorney Michael Chen, when I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Not one car, three. David's Lexus, Cheryl's BMW, and a white van I didn't recognize. Through my lace curtains, I watched my children get out, along with two people I'd never seen before, a woman in a business suit carrying a clipboard and a man in medical scrubs. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to finish rolling out the biscuit dough. Whatever this was, I would face it with dignity. David knocked on my front door, then used his key without waiting for me to answer. They'd all kept keys from when they were younger. For emergencies, they'd said. I'd never imagined they'd use them against me. "Mum," David called out, his voice artificially cheerful, "we're here to help you." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the front parlor, where they'd arranged themselves like a tribunal. The strange woman introduced herself as Sandra Mills from Adult Protective Services. The man was Dr. Raymond Phillips, who specialized in geriatric assessments. My children stood behind them, like prosecutors presenting their case. "Mrs. Ellison," Sandra Mills said, consulting her clipboard, "your children have expressed some concerns about your ability to live independently. They've reported incidents of confusion, unsafe living conditions, and memory problems." I looked at my children, really looked at them. Cheryl wouldn't meet my eyes. Luke stared at his shoes. David had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to stop what was happening. "What incidents?" I asked calmly. Dr. Phillips stepped forward. "Mrs. Ellison, your son David reports that you've been forgetting to pay bills, leaving appliances on, and becoming disoriented about time and dates." Every word was a lie, but I could see how they'd twisted the truth. The electric bill I'd paid early became forgetting to pay. Leaving beans simmering on the stove became dangerous forgetfulness. Being surprised by their sudden concern became disorientation. For the next hour, they put me through what they called an assessment. Memory tests, questions about current events, requests to show them my bill-paying system. I answered everything perfectly, but I could see it didn't matter. They'd already decided. Sandra Mills made notes on her clipboard, while Dr. Phillips examined my medicine cabinet, my refrigerator, my living conditions. They found nothing wrong. My house was clean, my food was fresh, my medications were properly organized, but they had a different agenda. "Mrs. Ellison," Sandra Mills said finally, "while you appear to be managing adequately now, your family has provided documentation of concerning incidents. We recommend a supervised living environment for your safety." That's when David pulled out more papers. Legal papers. "Mom, we've already spoken to Attorney Johnson about power of attorney. Given the circumstances, it's really the most responsible thing." My blood ran cold. "What Attorney Johnson?" I never agreed to meet with any attorney. Cheryl finally looked at me, her eyes filled with what she probably thought was compassion. Mama, we can't wait until something terrible happens. We love you too much for that. Within 2 hours, they'd packed a suitcase with my clothes, not the clothes I would have chosen, but what they thought an old woman in a care facility should wear. Simple dresses, comfortable shoes, nothing that might suggest I had a life or identity worth preserving. The ride to Magnolia Manor felt like a funeral procession. I sat in the back of David's Lexus, watching my neighborhood disappear through tinted windows. The house where I'd lived for 52 years grew smaller in the side mirror until I couldn't see it anymore. Magnolia Manor turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. Institutional beige walls, the smell of disinfectant barely covering other odors, and staff who spoke to residents like they were children. My apartment was a single room with a hospital bed, a dresser, and one window overlooking the parking lot. "You'll like it here, Mama," Cheryl said, unpacking my suitcase into the small dresser. "They have bingo on Tuesdays, and a book club on Thursdays." After they left, promising to visit soon, another lie, I was beginning to understand. I sat on the edge of that hospital bed and looked around my new prison, but I wasn't the helpless old woman they thought they'd deposited here. I was Margaret Rose Ellison, and I had $3.5 million in assets they knew nothing about. I also had an appointment with attorney Michael Chen that I'd missed, and a folder full of documents hidden in my bedroom dresser at home, the home they were probably already preparing to sell. But I also had something else. A phone number I'd memorized years ago. James Harrow had given me his personal number, told me to call any time, day or night, if I ever needed help. Well, I needed help now. At 9 o'clock that evening, when the hallways were quiet and the staff was busy with their evening routines, I slipped out to the payphone near the visitors' parking lot. My fingers shook as I dialed, but James Harrow answered on the second ring. "Margaret." His voice was sharp with concern. "I've been trying to reach you all day. You missed your appointment with Michael Chen, and when I called your house, your son David answered. He said you'd been moved to a care facility for your own safety." "James," I whispered into the phone, "they've made a terrible mistake, and I need you to help me fix it." Friday morning brought rain to Savannah, the kind of steady downpour that turns the city's brick streets into rivers and makes the Spanish moss drip like tears. I sat in the community room at Magnolia Manor, pretending to work on a jigsaw puzzle of the Eiffel Tower while actually planning my counterattack. The other residents chatted about their medications and their children's visits, but I was thinking about attorney Michael Chen's voice when James Harrow had called him from the payphone beside me last night. Involuntary commitment of a competent adult based on false information, Michael had said, his voice carrying clearly through the phone. "That's elder abuse, and it's actionable. We can have those power of attorney documents nullified by Monday morning." Now I just had to wait. The hardest part of any battle, Harold used to say, was the waiting. At 10:30, David walked into the community room wearing his best insurance salesman smile and carrying a clipboard of his own. Behind him came a woman I didn't recognize, young, blonde, with the kind of artificial friendliness that makes your skin crawl. "Mum," David said, sitting beside me at the puzzle table, "I'd like you to meet Jenny Morrison from Century 21. She's going to help us get the house ready for market." Jenny Morrison smiled brightly and pulled out photos of my house taken from every angle. "Mrs. Ellison, you have such a beautiful home. David tells me you're ready to downsize, which is so smart. The Victorian district market is really hot right now." I kept my face calm while studying the photos. They'd already been through my belongings. I realized rooms that had been filled with 52 years of memories looked sparse, stripped of the personal touches that made them mine. "We're thinking a quick sale," David continued, not noticing my silence. "Jenny believes we can list it for $425 and have offers within a week. That'll give you a nice nest egg for your care here." A nice nest egg. I almost laughed. If they only knew about the actual nest egg Harold had built, they'd choke on their coffee. Instead, I nodded and smiled, like the confused old woman they expected me to be. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said in my sweetest voice. "You children always know what's best." After they left, I went back to my room and waited. At 2 o'clock, a certified mail carrier arrived at Magnolia Manor, asking for David Ellison. The nurse at the front desk called David's office, and within an hour, my eldest son was back, this time without the smile. He found me in the sunroom, still working on that damned Eiffel Tower puzzle. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he sat down across from me. "Mum," he said carefully, "I got a letter today from an attorney named Michael Chen. He says you want to revoke the power of attorney documents." I looked up from the puzzle piece I was holding, a small section of blue Parisian sky, and met his eyes. "Did he now? How interesting." "Mum, you can't do this. We're trying to help you. The house needs to be sold, your finances need to be managed, and you need proper care." I placed the puzzle piece exactly where it belonged and folded my hands in my lap. "David, sweetheart, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you forged my signature on a note to get out of PE class?" He looked confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I knew you'd forged it the moment I saw it. Your handwriting was all wrong, and you'd spelled excused incorrectly. But I didn't say anything right away. I waited. I watched. I let you think you'd gotten away with something." David's face was getting paler. "Mum, I don't understand what—" "Then I called your PE teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. Turned out you owed her 3 days of detention for not bringing your gym clothes. So instead of missing 1 day of PE, you spent a week after school paying for your dishonesty." I stood up, smoothing my skirt with hands that weren't shaking anymore. "The power of attorney documents you had me sign. The ones your attorney Johnson prepared without my knowledge or consent. Michael Chen says they're not worth the paper they're printed on. Seems there are very specific legal requirements for such things, including independent representation for the grantor, requirements you chose to ignore." David stood too, his face flushed now, instead of pale. "Mum, you don't understand the legal complexities." "Oh, but I do, sweetheart. You see, I spent yesterday afternoon on the phone with some very interesting people. James Harrow from Harrow Financial Services, whom your father trusted with our investments. Michael Chen, who specializes in elder law, and Judge Patricia Williams. You might remember her as little Patty Williams from my 3rd grade class at Savannah Elementary." I watched my son's face as understanding began to dawn. "The house sale is cancelled, David. The power of attorney is revoked, and I'll be moving back home tomorrow morning with a very nice home health aide who specializes in protecting elderly people from family members who think they know better." That evening Cheryl and Luke arrived together, both looking like they'd been hit by trucks. We sat in the same community room where I'd learnt they were selling my house, but this time I wasn't pretending to be confused. "Mama," Cheryl began, her voice shaking, "we never meant to hurt you. We were just scared." "You were scared of what, exactly?" I asked. "That I might live my own life, make my own decisions, continue to be an independent human being instead of a burden you could manage." Luke, my baby boy who'd barely said a word through this whole ordeal, finally looked up at me. "Mum, we thought we were protecting you." "From what, Luke?" "From living in my own home, from managing my own affairs, from the dignity of making my own choices." None of them had an answer for that. They sat there in their expensive clothes, in their successful adult lives, looking like the children they'd been when they disappointed me. But this disappointment cut deeper than any childhood misbehavior ever could. "There's going to be a meeting Monday morning," I said finally. 9 o'clock at Michael Chen's office on Bull Street. "All of my legal documents will be reviewed and revised. You're welcome to attend, but you won't be signing anything on my behalf ever again." As they left, I saw Lena Washington walking across the parking lot, carrying a small suitcase and looking determined. She'd taken time off from her job and her classes to help me move back home. She'd stood by me when my own children had betrayed me. Tomorrow I would go back to my house on East Jones Street. But tonight, for the first time in days, I was going to sleep peacefully. The battle wasn't over, but I'd won the first important victory. I was nobody's burden. I never had been. Monday morning found me back in my own kitchen, making coffee in Harold's old percolator, and watching the sun stream through the windows that overlooked my garden. Lena was upstairs, unpacking my clothes into the dresser where they belonged, humming a gospel hymn I remembered from my childhood. The sound of it, the normalcy of it, made my heart settle into a rhythm it hadn't found since this whole ordeal began. But I wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. David, Cheryl, and Luke might have been outmaneuvered on the legal documents, But they still saw me as incompetent, still believed they knew what was best for their poor, confused mother. Time to show them exactly how sharp my mind remained. I pulled out my old address book, the red leather one Harold had given me for Christmas in 1978, and found the numbers I needed. Amazing how many of my former students had stayed in touch over the years, sending Christmas cards and wedding announcements, graduation photos and birth announcements. I'd kept every single one filed away in the secretary desk in my front parlor. My first call was to Tommy Patterson, who'd been one of my most challenging third graders back in 1971. Couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, drove his parents to distraction, but he was brilliant at mathematics, and I'd seen the potential everyone else missed. Now he was vice president at Savannah Bank and Trust, married with 3 children of his own. Mrs. Ellison. Tommy's voice carried genuine delight when his secretary put me through. Good Lord, I haven't heard from you in years. How are you? I'm well, Tommy, but I need a favor. A professional favor, and it needs to stay confidential. Anything for you, Mrs. Ellison. You saved my academic life in 3rd grade. I explained the situation carefully, without going into all the painful details. Tommy listened, and I could hear him making notes. By the time I finished, his voice had gone from warm to coldly professional. Mrs. Ellison, what your children tried to do is called financial elder abuse, and it's a felony in Georgia. If you need any documentation of your financial competency, I can have our senior loan officer prepare a complete assessment of your creditworthiness and financial management skills. Also, I'll flag your accounts for any suspicious activity. My second call was to Patricia Williams, Judge Patricia Williams now, though she'd always be little Patty Williams to me, the girl with pigtails, who'd struggled with reading until we found out she needed glasses. Mrs. Ellison. Patty's voice was warm with affection. I heard through the courthouse grapevine that you might be dealing with some family issues. How can I help? Patty couldn't get directly involved. Conflict of interest, she explained. But she could make sure any legal filings were expedited and that I had access to the best resources available. She also gave me the name of a private investigator who specialized in elder abuse cases. Mrs. Ellison, she said before we hung up, you taught me that being smart wasn't enough. You had to be brave too. Sounds like you're being both right now. My third call was to Robert Chen, no relation to my attorney Michael Chen, but another former student who'd gone into journalism. Bobby had been the kind of child who asked uncomfortable questions and never accepted easy answers. Now he was investigative reporter for the Savannah Morning News, specializing in stories about local corruption and social justice issues. Mrs. Ellison, Bobby said after I'd outlined the situation, this is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told. Elder abuse by family members is more common than people realize, and it usually involves money. Would you be willing to go on record? I thought about it carefully. Harold had always been a private man, and I'd followed his lead in keeping our financial business to ourselves. But sometimes privacy becomes a prison, and silence enables abuse. Bobby, I said finally, let me show you what real elder abuse looks like, and what happens when an old teacher decides to fight back. By noon I had 3 powerful allies who understood exactly what I was dealing with. Tommy Patterson was reviewing my financial records and preparing documentation of my competency. Judge Williams was expediting legal reviews and making sure I had proper representation. Bobby Chen was researching similar cases and preparing a comprehensive article about family-based elder abuse. That afternoon, James Harrow came by the house, bringing flowers from his wife's garden and a bottle of wine to celebrate my liberation, as he called it. We sat in my front parlor, while Lena prepared lunch in the kitchen. Margaret, James said, settling into Harold's old chair, I've been thinking about your situation. Your children made one crucial mistake. They underestimated you, but more importantly, they have no idea about the extent of your financial resources. I poured sweet tea from my crystal pitcher and considered his words. I've been thinking the same thing, James. They tried to control me because they thought I was helpless and poor. Time to show them how wrong they are. James smiled. The kind of smile that suggested he was enjoying this more than he probably should. I've prepared some documents for your review. A private trust, administered by Harrow Financial Services, with you maintaining complete control over all decisions. The trust would be funded with $500,000 initially, with specific instructions for disbursement. He handed me a folder thick with legal documents. The trustee would be someone you trust completely, someone who's shown you genuine care and respect. The funds would be used to ensure you have the best possible care, legal representation, and financial security. I opened the folder and saw Lena's name listed as primary trustee and eventual beneficiary. James, this is very generous. It's strategic, Margaret. Your children think they can steamroll you because they believe you have limited resources. Let them discover exactly how limited their own knowledge is. That evening, as Lena and I sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Spanish moss gold, my phone rang. It was David, and his voice carried an edge of panic I'd never heard before. Mum, I got a call from Jenny Morrison. She says someone's filed an injunction against the house sale. The listing has been pulled, and there's some kind of legal hold on the property. I rocked gently in my porch swing, listening to the mockingbirds in my magnolia tree. Is that so? Mum? What's going on? Who's paying for all these lawyers? I smiled into the phone. David, sweetheart, there are a lot of things you don't know about your mother, but you're about to learn. Tuesday afternoon brought unseasonably warm weather to Savannah, the kind of Indian summer day that makes the camellia bushes bloom early and confuses the mockingbirds. I was in my garden, deadheading the last of my roses, when Lena came outside with a worried expression and my cordless phone. Miss Maggie, she said quietly. Your daughter Cheryl is on the phone. She sounds strange. I took the phone, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves. Hello, sweetheart. Cheryl's voice was tight with barely controlled hysteria. Mama, we need to talk. All this legal nonsense has to stop. You're making yourself sick with stress. And frankly, you're embarrassing the family. Embarrassing the family. I almost laughed. Am I, dear? How exactly am I doing that? People are talking, Mama. At church, at the country club, at David's office. Everyone's heard about the lawsuit, and it makes us all look terrible. I sat down on my garden bench, the one Harold had built for our 30th wedding anniversary. Cheryl, what lawsuit are you referring to? There was a long pause, then the sound of papers rustling. The elder abuse complaint, the financial misconduct allegations, the investigation into our power of attorney documents. It's all going to come out, and we'll be ruined. Ah, word was getting around, just as I'd hoped it would. And why would any of that matter if you were truly acting in my best interests? Another pause. Longer this time. Mama, I think you should come stay with me for a few days. You're obviously not thinking clearly, and this stress isn't good for someone your age. Someone my age. There it was again, the assumption that being 84 meant being incompetent. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, dear, but thank you for your concern. I hung up and looked at Lena, who was pretending to water my impatience while obviously listening to every word. Miss Maggie, are you really okay? You seem calm, but this has to be taking a toll. I patted the bench beside me, and she sat down, her dark eyes full of genuine worry. Lena, sweetheart, I spent 46 years teaching children. Some of those children were sweet and honest, and some were manipulative little actors who thought they could outsmart the teacher. I learned to tell the difference. Thursday morning, I woke up feeling more tired than usual, with a headache that aspirin couldn't touch, and a general feeling of malaise that reminded me unpleasantly of the flu I'd had 2 winters ago. By afternoon, I was running a slight fever and feeling genuinely unwell. Lena wanted to call Dr. Morrison, but I assured her it was probably just a cold. Instead, I asked her to call my children and tell them I wasn't feeling well, that I needed some time to rest, and that I didn't want any visitors for a few days. The response was immediate and telling. David called within an hour, not to check on my health, but to ask if I'd reconsidered the assisted living solution. Cheryl arrived with flowers and a casserole, but spent most of her visit looking around the house and making notes about what would need to be dealt with when the time came. Luke called but didn't visit, which wasn't surprising. He'd always been uncomfortable around illness. By Saturday I was feeling better, but decided to extend my period of recovery a few more days. It was fascinating to listen to the messages on my answering machine, to hear how quickly my children's concern shifted from my well-being to their own convenience. Sunday morning, instead of going to church as I had for 63 years, I asked Lena to spread the word that I was too ill for visitors. By Sunday afternoon, the phone calls started coming. Church friends, neighbors, former students, all wanting to know if I needed anything, if there was anything they could do. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought homemade chicken soup. Pastor Williams called to ask if I needed pastoral care. Even the mailman, Mr. Rodriguez, knocked on the door to make sure I was all right. But the most interesting call came Monday morning from my hairdresser, Doris Patterson, Tommy Patterson's wife. As it turned out, she'd been doing my hair every Friday for 15 years, and she had some interesting news. "Mrs. Ellison," Doris said, her voice carefully neutral, "I thought you should know that your daughter Cheryl was in here yesterday, asking about arrangements for memorial services. She wanted to know which funeral home you'd prefer, and whether you'd want the service at Christ Episcopal." I nearly dropped the phone. "Memorial services. She said you were very ill, that the family was making preparations in case the worst happened. She even asked about flowers and whether you'd want a closed casket." After I hung up, I sat in Harold's chair for a long time, staring out at my garden and thinking, my children weren't just waiting for me to die, they were planning for it, planning around it, planning to benefit from it. That afternoon, Lena helped me get dressed in my best navy suit and my pearl necklace, the one Harold had given me for our silver anniversary. We drove to the Savannah Historic Foundation's autumn fundraiser at the Telfair Museum, where I knew half the social register would be present. The look on their faces when I walked into that reception was worth every moment of the past week's illness. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Mrs. Pritchard from the garden club actually gasped audibly. I spent 2 hours at that reception, chatting with old friends, admiring the art, and making sure everyone knew I was very much alive and very much in control of my own affairs. By the time Lena and I left, word had spread through Savannah's social circles like kudzu in summer. Wednesday morning's Savannah Morning News carried Bobby Chen's article on page 1. The funeral that wasn't, how one family tried to bury their mother before she died. The article was comprehensive, well-researched, and devastating. It detailed the attempted power of attorney fraud, the forced placement in Magnolia Manor, the unauthorized house listing, and yes, the premature funeral planning. The phone started ringing at 7 in the morning and didn't stop until I unplugged it at 10 that night. Reporters, supporters, former students and neighbors, all calling to express their outrage and support. The story had touched a nerve in the community. Everyone knew someone who'd been taken advantage of by family members. Everyone feared ending up in my situation. David called on Lena's cell phone. Since I wasn't answering my own, his voice was shaking with rage, and I suspected fear. "Mum, how could you do this to us? How could you humiliate your own children this way?" I took the phone from Lena and walked out to my front porch, where I could see my neighbors working in their gardens, living their lives, treating their elderly family members with dignity and respect. "David," I said calmly, "I didn't do anything to you. I simply told the truth about what you did to me. If that's humiliating, perhaps you should consider why." Friday morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of October day that makes you grateful to be alive and living in Savannah. I woke early and made biscuits from my grandmother's recipe, the same ones I'd made for my family every Sunday for 50 years. Today felt like a Sunday, even though it was the middle of the week. Today felt like a new beginning. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the fellowship hall at Christ Episcopal Church, wearing my best dress, the burgundy wool with the pearl buttons that Harold had always loved, and carrying a leather portfolio that contained the most important documents I'd ever signed. Behind me came Lena, looking beautiful and nervous in the navy suit we'd bought together yesterday. Behind her came James Harrow and attorney Michael Chen, both carrying briefcases and wearing the kind of serious expressions that meant business was about to be conducted. The fellowship hall was set up with round tables, each covered with white linen and decorated with chrysanthemums from my garden. I'd invited 40 people, church friends, neighbors, former students, and yes, my 3 children and their families. Everyone who'd been part of my life in Savannah. Everyone who'd known me as a person rather than a problem to be solved. My children sat at the table closest to the front, looking like defendants at a trial. David kept checking his watch and shifting in his seat. Cheryl had brought her husband Robert and their 2 teenage children, who looked mortified to be there. Luke had come alone, which wasn't surprising. His wife Patricia had stopped speaking to me years ago after some perceived slight I'd never understood. At exactly 10 o'clock, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The conversation stopped, and 40 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. I felt Harold's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, giving me strength. "Friends," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "thank you for coming this morning. I know this is unusual, but recent events in my life have made me realize that some things need to be said out loud, in front of witnesses, so there can be no misunderstanding later." I nodded to Michael Chen, who stood and opened his briefcase. "As most of you know, I'm a widow. My husband Harold passed away 12 years ago, leaving me with what I thought was a modest inheritance and the instruction to live comfortably on his insurance and investments. What I didn't know until recently was exactly how comfortable Harold had intended for me to be." Michael handed me the first document, the financial assessment James Harrow had prepared. "My total assets, including real estate, investments and liquid accounts, amount to approximately $3.7 million. The room went completely silent. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the sound of traffic on Bull Street, a mockingbird singing in the oak tree outside. But not a single person in that room made a sound. David's face had gone pale. Cheryl was gripping her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Luke was staring at me, as if I'd announced I was from Mars. "Now," I continued, accepting the second document from Michael, "this morning I'm reading my new will, properly witnessed and legally binding, which supersedes all previous versions." I put on my reading glasses and began. "To my son David Alexander Ellison, who taught me that blood relationship doesn't guarantee love or respect, I leave the sum of $10, so he cannot say he was forgotten." David started to stand, his face flushed with anger, but his wife Karen put a hand on his arm and pulled him back down. "To my daughter Cheryl Marie Ellison Patterson, who taught me that helping someone doesn't mean they'll help you in return, I leave the sum of $10, so she cannot say she was forgotten." Cheryl made a small, wounded sound, like an animal in pain. "To my son Luke William Ellison, who taught me that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of cruelty, I leave the sum of $10, so he cannot say he was forgotten." Luke was staring at his hands, his face completely expressionless. I took off my glasses and looked at my children, really looked at them, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "The remainder of my estate, approximately $3.7 million after taxes and expenses, I leave to Lena Marie Washington, who taught me that family is defined by love and loyalty, not by blood." The room erupted, not with cheers or applause, but with the kind of stunned murmuring that follows shocking news. David shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You can't do this," he shouted. "You can't give our inheritance to some stranger. We'll contest this will, we'll prove you're not competent to make these decisions." Michael Chen stood up then, his voice calm and professional. "Mr. Ellison, your mother has been evaluated by 3 independent physicians, 2 psychiatric professionals, and a geriatric specialist. All have certified her complete mental competency. Additionally, this will has been witnessed by Judge Patricia Williams and Superior Court Clerk Thomas Patterson, both of whom can attest to your mother's soundness of mind and clarity of purpose." Cheryl was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "Mama, how could you do this to us? We're your children." I walked over to their table and looked down at my 3 children, the babies I'd nursed and raised, the children I'd supported through college and marriage and divorce and business failures, and every crisis life had thrown at them. "Yes," I said quietly, "you are my children, and I loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your happiness and success, but when I needed you, you saw me as a burden. When I needed respect, you tried to control me. When I needed dignity, you tried to warehouse me." I turned to look at Lena, who was crying too, but quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Lena brought me soup when I was lonely. She listened to my stories when no one else cared. She saw me as a person worth knowing, not a problem to be solved. That's what family does. David was gathering papers, preparing to leave, his face set in the stubborn expression I remembered from his childhood. "This isn't over, Mom. No court in Georgia is going to let you give away millions of dollars to your housekeeper." Judge Patricia Williams, who'd been sitting quietly at a back table, stood up then. "Actually, Mr. Ellison, that's exactly what courts are designed to protect, a competent adult's right to dispose of their property as they see fit. Your mother's will is legally unassailable." As my children gathered their things and prepared to leave, taking their wounded pride and their shattered expectations with them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the deep satisfaction that comes from standing up for yourself, from refusing to be diminished by people who should have loved you better. The other guests began to approach me then. Former students with tears in their eyes, church friends with words of support, neighbors who'd watched this drama unfold with growing concern. Everyone wanted to shake my hand, to tell me I'd done the right thing, to assure me they understood. But the person whose opinion mattered most was sitting alone at her table, staring at the document that had just changed her life forever. I walked over and sat beside Lena, taking her hands in mine. "Miss Maggie," she whispered, "I can't accept this. It's too much, it's not right." "Lena," I said firmly, "in my 84 years, I've learnt that right and wrong aren't always about what's fair, sometimes they're about what's necessary. This is necessary." She was quiet for a long moment, looking around the fellowship hall at the faces of people who'd known me for decades, who'd watched me teach their children and bury my husband and face this final betrayal with dignity. "What do you want me to do with it?" she asked finally. I smiled, feeling Harold's approval like sunshine on my face. "I want you to live, sweetheart. I want you to finish your nursing degree, open that clinic you've dreamed about, help people who need help. I want you to use this gift the way Harold would have wanted, to make the world a little bit better." As we sat there together, surrounded by people who understood the difference between love and obligation, I realized something important. I wasn't just giving Lena my money, I was giving her my legacy. The legacy Harold and I had built through hard work and careful planning, the legacy our children had tried to steal through manipulation and lies. Now it would go to someone who would use it wisely, someone who would honor what it represented, someone who had earned it through kindness when cruelty would have been easier, through loyalty when betrayal was more profitable, through love when indifference was expected. That was worth more than all the money in Harold's carefully managed accounts. That was worth everything. But the pew directly in front of mine, where my children and their families had sat every first Sunday of the month for the past 12 years, remained empty. Sunday morning found me back in my usual pew at Christ Episcopal, the third row from the front on the right side, where Harold and I had sat together for 37 years of marriage. The congregation was buzzing with subdued conversations that stopped when I walked down the center aisle, Lena beside me wearing the navy dress we'd bought at Belk's downtown. People nodded respectfully, smiled with genuine warmth, and several reached out to squeeze my hand as I passed. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about the difference between honor and obligation, about how true respect comes from understanding rather than assumption. His eyes met mine several times during the service, and I knew he was thinking about the difficult conversations he'd had with David and Cheryl after Friday's will reading. They'd come to him, I'd heard through the church grapevine, demanding that he talk sense into their mother, convince me to reconsider my rash decision. Pastor Williams had declined, reminding them that honoring one's parents works both ways. Children should honor their parents' wisdom and choices, not just their parents' money. Monday morning brought interesting news from Tommy Patterson at Savannah Bank and Trust. He called while I was having coffee and reading the newspaper, his voice professionally neutral but carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. After the service, as Lena and I stood on the front steps accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends and neighbors, I saw David's silver Lexus drive slowly past the church. He didn't stop, didn't wave, just drove by like a tourist observing something foreign and incomprehensible. The sight of it made me sad, but not regretful. Some bridges have to be burned to prevent further invasion. I set down my coffee cup, with steady hands. How much was he trying to withdraw, Tommy? The full balance, approximately $12,000. He claimed it was for your care expenses at Magnolia Manor, but of course we knew you'd been discharged from that facility. Mrs. Ellison, I thought you should know that your son David attempted to transfer funds from your joint checking account on Friday afternoon, after your will reading. The account has been frozen pending legal review, as per your instructions, so no unauthorized transactions could be completed. "Mama," she said, standing at the edge of my flower bed like she was afraid to come closer. "We need to talk." Tuesday brought a visit from Cheryl, who arrived without calling first, and found me in my garden, pruning the rose bushes for winter. She looked terrible, pale, thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations with her husband Robert. $12,000. Not a fortune by any means, but telling in its desperation. David had tried to take what little he thought I had left, even after learning about the inheritance he'd lost through his own greed and manipulation. I continued pruning, making clean cuts just above the leaf nodes the way Harold had taught me 40 years ago. "About what, sweetheart?" "About Friday. About what you did. Robert says we should contest the will, get you declared incompetent. But I don't know if that's right." I looked up at my daughter, this woman of 53 who'd once been a little girl with pigtails and scraped knees, who'd come running to me every time the world hurt her feelings. "And what do you think is right, Cheryl?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching me work. "I think we hurt you," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I think we treated you like you didn't matter, like your feelings didn't count." I set down my pruning shears and brushed dirt from my gardening gloves. "Yes," I said simply, "you did." Cheryl started crying then, the same desperate sobs she'd cried as a child when she'd broken something precious and couldn't figure out how to fix it. "But Mama, $3 million to someone we barely know. How can you throw away our whole inheritance?" "Cheryl, what inheritance did you earn? What sacrifices did you make? What love did you show that entitled you to Harold's hard work and careful planning?" I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after an hour of kneeling in the garden, and looked at my daughter with all the patience I'd learnt in 46 years of teaching children who'd made mistakes. She couldn't answer, because there was no good answer. She'd assumed she deserved my money because she'd been born to me, not because she'd earned it through kindness or loyalty, or even basic respect. "Miss Maggie," Lena said, showing me her phone with its stream of notifications. "There are reporters calling the school, wanting to interview you. Someone from CNN left a message. And look at this." She showed me comment after comment from people applauding my decision, sharing their own experiences with ungrateful family members, praising my courage in standing up for myself. The story had struck a nerve across the country, touching everyone who'd watched elderly relatives be mistreated by children who saw them as burdens rather than blessings. Wednesday brought the most interesting development yet. Lena came home from her classes at Armstrong State with news that made both of us laugh until we cried. The story of my will reading had spread through the nursing program, and someone had shared it on social media. The post had gone viral. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories of family betrayal and elderly abuse. But the most meaningful response came Thursday morning in the form of a handwritten letter delivered by the postman. The return address made my heart skip. Luke William Ellison, my baby boy who'd said the least and hurt me the most through his silence. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd opened his report cards and college acceptance letters and army discharge papers, and read his words with tears streaming down my face. "Dear Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect you to change your will. I just want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. I was a coward. I let David and Cheryl convince me that you were becoming a burden when I knew better. I knew you were sharp as ever. I knew you were capable, but it was easier to go along with them than to stand up for you. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I failed you when you needed me most. I'm sorry I let you down. You raised me better than that, and I forgot everything you taught me about standing up for what's right. I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me, not because I deserve it, but because you're the kind of person who forgives people who don't deserve it. That's who you've always been. That's why I should have protected you instead of abandoning you. I love you, Mom. I always have, even when I was too weak to show it. Your son, Luke." "Luke," I said when he answered, his voice cautious and uncertain. "Thank you for your letter. Would you like to come for dinner Sunday? I'm making pot roast." I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with Harold's insurance papers and my marriage certificate and all the other documents that marked the important moments of my life. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Luke's number. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then I heard him crying, deep sobs that sounded like they were coming from the bottom of his heart. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally. "I'd like that very much." That evening, as Lena and I sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Spanish moss gold and listening to the mockingbirds sing their evening songs, I reflected on the strange turns life takes. A month ago, I'd been a lonely old woman whose children saw her as a burden. Now I was a wealthy woman with a new daughter who saw me as a blessing, and at least one biological child who'd remembered what love was supposed to look like. It wasn't the ending I'd expected, but it was better than the one I'd feared. Sometimes that's the most you can ask for. Not happiness, exactly, but the satisfaction of knowing you stood up for yourself when it mattered most. Christmas morning arrived in Savannah with the kind of gentle warmth that makes you grateful to be Southern, even in winter. I woke in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the sounds and smells that had comforted me for 52 years. Coffee percolating in Harold's old pot, bacon sizzling in the cast-iron skillet his mother had given us as a wedding gift, and Lena humming Silent Night as she moved around my kitchen like she'd been born to it. 3 months had passed since the will reading that changed everything. 3 months of watching my decision ripple outward like stones thrown in still water, creating waves I'd never expected and consequences I couldn't have imagined. The most surprising consequence was the attention. Bobby Chen's article in the Savannah Morning News had been picked up by news outlets across the country. I'd been interviewed by reporters from Atlanta, Charleston, and even New York. A television producer had called about turning my story into a documentary about elder abuse and family dysfunction. A publisher had inquired about my interest in writing a book. All of it was flattering, but exhausting. At 84, I wasn't particularly interested in fame. What I wanted was peace, dignity, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd made decisions based on love rather than fear. That morning, as Lena and I prepared Christmas breakfast, I heard a car in the driveway. Through the lace curtains, I saw Luke's pickup truck, followed by a sedan I didn't recognize. My heart jumped with the same anticipation I'd felt every Christmas morning when my children were small. Luke came up the front walk, carrying a poinsettia and wearing the nervous expression he'd worn as a child when he wasn't sure of his welcome. Behind him walked a woman about 40, with kind eyes and greying hair, holding the hands of 2 children I'd never seen before. "Mum," Luke said when I opened the door, "I'd like you to meet Sarah. We've been seeing each other for about 6 months, and these are her children, Emma and James." Sarah stepped forward with the confidence of a woman who understood the importance of first impressions. "Mrs. Ellison, Luke has told me so much about you. I hope you don't mind us intruding on your Christmas." I looked at this woman who'd made my son smile for the first time in months, at the children who were staring up at me with curiosity rather than judgment, and felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't realized was still closed. We spent the morning in my front parlor, opening presents and sharing stories. Lena had bought me a beautiful silk scarf and a first edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, my favorite book which I'd taught to countless students over the years. Luke brought me a photo album filled with pictures from his childhood, each one labeled with memories I'd thought he'd forgotten. "Please," I said, stepping aside to welcome them in, "call me Maggie. And you're not intruding, you're family." But the most meaningful gift came from Sarah's children. Emma, who was 8, had drawn me a picture of a house with flowers and a figure labeled Great-Grandma Maggie. James, who was 10, had written me a poem about Christmas and grandmothers and how some people are family even when they're not related. After lunch, while Luke and Sarah helped Lena clear the dishes and the children played in the garden, I slipped away to my bedroom and pulled out the letter I'd been writing for weeks. The letter I'd intended to be my final word on everything that had happened, my explanation to anyone who wondered why I'd made the choices I'd made. As we sat around the dining room table eating Christmas dinner, ham with pineapple glaze, sweet potato casserole, green beans with almonds and cornbread dressing, made from my grandmother's recipe, I realized something profound had happened. My biological family had broken apart, but a new family had grown in its place. Not the family I'd been born into or married into, but the family I'd chosen and who had chosen me. But reading it now, surrounded by laughter from my kitchen and the sound of children playing in my garden, I realized the letter was wrong. It was angry and bitter, and focused on what I'd lost rather than what I'd gained. So I tore it up and wrote a new one, this time addressing it to myself. As evening fell and Luke's new family prepared to leave, Sarah took me aside in the front hallway, where Harold's portrait still hung beside our wedding photo. "Mrs. Ellison, Maggie," she said quietly, "I want you to know that Luke talks about you all the time, about how strong you are, how you taught him to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He regrets what happened between you and his siblings, but he's grateful you gave him a chance to make things right. Dear Margaret, you spent 84 years trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect teacher. You sacrificed your own needs for everyone else's wants, gave away your own dreams to fund other people's ambitions, and measured your worth by how much you could do for people who didn't appreciate your efforts. But you were never a burden. You were never too old, too demanding, or too difficult. You were a woman who deserved love and respect, and when you didn't receive them, you had the courage to demand them. Your story didn't end with betrayal and bitterness. It ended with wisdom and new beginnings, with chosen family and unexpected joy. Harold would be proud of the woman you became after he left. Your children may never understand what they lost, but Lena will always know what she gained. You were never a burden, Margaret. You were always a blessing, even when the people who should have known better forgot how to see it. Love, the woman you fought to remain." After they left, Lena and I sat on the front porch swing, wrapped in quilts and watching the Christmas lights twinkle on houses up and down East Jones Street. She'd finished her nursing degree the week before, graduating summa cum laude, and had already been accepted into the nurse practitioner program at the Medical University of South Carolina. I squeezed her hand, thinking about second chances and the grace that makes them possible. "Sarah, we all make mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, it's whether they get back up and try to do better." "Miss Maggie," she said, leaning against my shoulder the way my own daughters used to do when they were small, "I've been thinking about the clinic I want to open. What would you think about calling it the Harold Ellison Community Health Center?" "I think he would have loved that," I said. "But I have one condition." Lena looked up at me with questioning eyes. Tears filled my eyes as I thought about my husband, the man who'd worked so hard and saved so carefully to leave me secure. He'd never imagined his insurance money would help provide medical care for people who couldn't afford it, but I knew he would have approved. "I want to be involved. Not running things, you're perfectly capable of that, but maybe helping with the business side or fundraising or whatever needs doing. I spent 46 years helping children learn to read. Maybe I can spend whatever years I have left helping grown-ups learn to be healthy." But after a long moment, the car moved on, disappearing into the Savannah night, like a ghost of Christmas past. As we sat there planning our future together, I heard a car slow down in front of the house. Through the gathering darkness, I could see David's silver Lexus pausing at the curb. For a moment I thought he might stop, might get out, might make some gesture toward reconciliation. I felt sad for him, sad for all my children who'd chosen pride over love, money over family, control over connection, but I didn't feel guilty anymore. I'd given them every opportunity to choose differently, every chance to see me as a person, rather than a problem. Some people, I'd learned, will never understand that love is a choice you make every day, not a birthright you inherit. Some people will always see generosity as weakness, kindness as foolishness, and age as incompetence. But some people, like Lena, like Luke, like the new family growing around my dining room table, understand that the best inheritance isn't money or property or things you can put in a bank vault. The best inheritance is the knowledge that you're loved, not for what you can give, but for who you are. As Christmas night settled over Savannah, bringing the promise of a new year and new possibilities, I closed my eyes and felt Harold's presence in the evening breeze that stirred the Spanish moss. I whispered to him about the clinic that would bear his name, about the children who would receive medical care because of his careful planning, about the community that would be stronger because of his legacy. And I whispered one more thing, the truth I'd learnt through months of heartbreak and healing. I was never a burden, Harold. I was always exactly what you said I was, your greatest treasure. And now I'm Lena's treasure too, and she's mine. Some stories do have happy endings, even when they start with betrayal. The mockingbirds answered with their evening song, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight. Christmas was over, but my new life was just beginning.